Amsterdam, the capital city of the Netherlands, dominates the attention of tourists in this region, and rightly so. It's a place of extremes, simultaneously hip and sleazy, where the high culture during the day is offset by a notorious nightlife. The overriding atmosphere here is one of tolerance, whether it be to the cannabis cafes, a thriving gay scene, or endless tourists 365 days a year. Amsterdam is the prime example of a city where literally anything goes.
While a third of North Holland's population make the city their home though, the rest of the province gives a more honest portrayal of Dutch life. Charming cities such as Haarlem and Alkmaar exemplify the friendly populace, while former seafaring villages dot the coastline, and quaint rural towns and farmhouses fill the open countryside.
In the warmer months, the best way of getting around is like everybody else, on a bike. And getting from place to place couldn't be simpler. Whether you're making light of the traffic in the city, or you're going on to explore more picturesque landscapes, 2 wheels are quicker and more relaxing than 2 feet, and of course they're greener and healthier than 4 wheels.
I'm planning to cycle around North Holland before returning to experience all that Amsterdam has to offer. But before I go anywhere, I'm going to need to sort out my ride.
If you're close enough, you can bring your own bike, but it's not necessary because the city is literally chock-a-block with places to rent one. And lots of competition, of course, means prices are relatively cheap, even for longer periods of time. Railway stations also regularly have rental shops, and there are bike repair shops almost everywhere you go.
Even if, like myself, you're planning a longer trip, then there's still only a minimal amount of preparation involved. Although the bikes favoured here are pretty basic, you should always make sure your seat and handlebars are at a comfortable height before you set off. With the pedal at 6 o'clock, your foot should be able to rest comfortably with your knees straight, thus getting maximum power and avoiding muscle strains. Similarly, handlebars that are set too low can cause back injuries, and the seat should always remain level. Everyone is different, so always check before you set off, particularly if you've hired your bike. But ultimately, it's about what's comfortable, as you might be in that position for some time. Needless to say, you should always test your brakes and tyres. But given that the terrain here is fairly tame, these checks should be enough to ensure that your journey goes smoothly. A repair kit, water and a map are all prerequisites, although the latter might not be needed as much as you think. The clearly labelled bike paths are probably the best in the world and crisscross the country, with the national cycle paths marked by a blue sign with a white bicycle. There are also other routes signposted that list the destination as well as how far away it is. Given how the entire area is lined with bike routes, I'm wondering whether it might be possible to circle the entire province without having to leave my bike lane.
The infrastructure of the country means that bikes and cars generally aren't competing for the roads, so it's much safer. In fact, the biggest danger to you coming off your bike is probably a seasonal headwind. The Dutch tend not to wear cycle helmets, so whether you do or not, it's down to personal preference.
One of the regular mistakes made when talking about this country is to label it incorrectly as Holland instead of the Netherlands. There are 12 provinces that make up the geography of the country, and only citizens of 2 of them, North and South Holland, can say that they are from Holland. As a comparative example, it's like referring to the UK as England, something that wouldn't please the Welsh or the Scots.
You can trace the origin of this misconception back to the 17th century. As the country established trade routes around the world, most of the ships came from the area that's today known as North and South Holland. Now, at this juncture, the Netherlands as we know it didn't exist. So when sailors abroad were asked where they came from, they simply answered with their province, Holland. Seeing as most Dutch sailors came from this region, the rest of the world was none the wiser.
The other opinions foreigners have on the country are much closer to the truth. Yes, it's not hard to pick up a ball of cheese and a pair of clogs. And yes, they love sexy football. And yes, the countryside is full of windmills and tulips. But to paint such a broad picture of such a vibrant country would be doing it a great disservice.
It's believed there are more bicycles in the Netherlands than there are people. And in fact, 85% of the population own at least one bike. That's because 99% of the country is flatter than a proverbial pancake. So getting around by bike is very easy, and it's also very cheap. You're saving money by not needing to buy fuel for a car, and that in turn means you're helping to save the planet. And you don't need a fancy mountain bike with 24 gears to get around here either, because there are barely any hills, let alone mountains, and the distances between all the major cities are fairly short.
The first small town on our route is Monnikendam, established by monks in the 12th century. And despite being ransacked several times and enduring numerous fires over the centuries, there are still historical landmarks like the St. Nicholas Church that remain. Today, the town relies mainly on tourism as a source of income because of its picturesque setting. But it's been expanded to house the many people now living here who commute into Amsterdam every day. It's here that you first start to leave the built-up outskirts of Amsterdam and enter the countryside. Rural tourism has become a big thing in this area as people look to escape to the silence, space, and most of all, the authenticity exemplified by North Holland. Interestingly, it's mainly the Dutch themselves who are taking these holidays, keen to explore their own country and revel in the great outdoors. This atmosphere by its very nature can only be experienced in the smaller towns and villages in the area, and too many visitors destroys this peacefulness. Hence, most of the places here have their hand in tourism in some way, which essentially helps to spread the wealth as well as maintain the nomadic experience. The Dutch are also big purveyors of responsible eco-tourism, like most of this area of Europe, and the bicycles are a big part of this. The best places for solitude, though, are nestled in the agricultural heartland between citadels. Staying on a farm has become a popular alternative accommodation, where they have space to house guests, while knowing at the same time that their visitors aren't there for the 5-star treatment. On some, you can even pay your way by working on the farm, helping out with daily tasks, and learning yourself a new set of skills. The Overlijke Hove is a cattle and sheep farm a mile west of Monnikendam, which offers modern and well-furnished accommodation in its 6 rooms. The living area allows you to cook your own food, mingle with other guests, and sample the farm while having your breakfast.
One of the unique features here is that you can sit at the dinner table and enjoy your meal along with the cows who are in the farm building next door. Now, it's worth noting that the cows can see through this glass too, so I won't say it too loudly, but I think we're having steak tonight, but don't tell them. Cheers, guys. Great milk, very fresh.
Unsurprisingly, the farm is on a canal, and you can take a boat out from the terrace at the back of the property. If anything, the location is perfect. A nice, quiet, rural area with plenty of open countryside, the sea is a short distance away, and yet we're still only 10 minutes drive from Amsterdam. If you're game, you can also try your hand at some farm activities.
to. Come on. Bed you go. Come on.
There are also organisations that will source accommodation specifically for cyclists who don't necessarily know where they'll end up. Friend-a-Nopter Fits, or Friends of the Bicycle, require an annual fee to join, but this allows you to contact them in advance to find a place to stay. It could be a townhouse somewhere in suburbia or another farmhouse, but they'll get you a bed that will be both welcoming, cheap, and give you an interesting insight into everyday Dutch life. The archetypal Dutch village of Edam is most famous for the cheese it gave its name to. Before cheese making though, shipbuilding brought prosperity to the town that gained its name from a dam built on the River E. Today, its protected architecture and pleasant streets make a trip to Edam worthwhile, especially if you plan on dismounting your bike and strolling the streets across the historic swing bridges. The dam square is the centre point, while as well as an Edam museum with a floating cellar, you can also visit the Cheese Way House in the spring and summer.
For several centuries, up until the 18th century, Edam was the most popular cheese in the world, helped by the fact that it aged well, and when wrapped in wax to protect it, it could be shipped almost anywhere. It's important to remember, though, that Edam is the name of the type of cheese rather than its place of origin, so the correct name when it comes from this region is Dutch Edam.
In fact, it reached as far as South America, where a popular myth was born. Having run out of cannonballs, a Uruguayan sea captain ordered they fire balls of Edam at an enemy ship instead, in an attempt to tear holes in its sails. It appears the cheese was too good to eat for this method to catch on though. Although the cheese itself is no longer made in Edam, the factory-made cheese is still brought back here for storage in the 18th century cheese warehouses, where it's monitored to maturity. The popular choice of red wax originated from when the cheeses used to be stored in wine barrels when transported around the world.
The thing about Edam cheese is that there's hardly any smell, but when you actually taste it, it's very cheesy. Did you know that it's the only cheese that's always made backwards? Have a think about that.
The Netherlands is a country which literally has water coursing through its veins, but North Holland is also surrounded by water, with the east side of the province forming a long coastal stretch along the Zuiderzee that runs from the tip of the country right into the canals of Amsterdam. The towns and villages along this stretch all have strong links with the water, and there are plenty of old stories of mermaids and seafarers that originated here.
The Dutch East India Company ruled the high seas after they were formed in the early 17th century. They forged trade routes to Asia and became the biggest trading company in the world.
Hoorn was a major harbour town during this golden age and was one of 3 bases the company had along the shores of North Holland. Abel Tasman set out from here on the first European voyage that discovered New Zealand and Fiji, and Tasmania is named after the Dutchman. Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America, was given its name by a sailor who was from here. Today, the town retains a charm that feels genuine, while the cosy harbour still sees an abundance of boats and ships as the local fishermen set off every morning. The Hoofdtoren is the main landmark of the town, a former defence post that's now a restaurant, and decent seafood is not something in short supply in this neck of the woods. Naturally, when the Dutch East India Company collapsed at the dawn of the 19th century, the economic fate of Hoorn fell with it. But today, the wealth that resided here during this period is still reflected in the glorious old buildings that line the streets. Along with Hoorn and Amsterdam, the third great port here during the reign of the Dutch East India Company was Enkhuizen. Protruding from the eastern tip of the province in a less sheltered location, the town hosted more than 50,000 inhabitants around the 17th century, the same as Amsterdam. But as the harbour slowly silted up, its power on the high seas dwindled. Today, the Zuiderzee Museum gives a glimpse into this time. The park there contains authentic period buildings, including a reconstruction of an old fishing village, with a harbour, church and schoolhouse, while traditional crafts such as fish smoking and sail making are performed. There are also numerous boats on display outside and famous Dutch paintings inside. There are still clippers and schooners sat in the town's 3 pretty harbours, and it's possible to take these out onto the water, but normally at a steep cost. One thing you are guaranteed for your money though is a smooth ride. "27% of the total area of the Netherlands and 60% of its population currently sits below sea level, and floods have always been a real danger in this part of the country. After a great flood in 1916, an enclosure dam was constructed that forever barricaded the inland Zuiderzee from the North Sea and beyond. This created the freshwater lake of the IJsselmeer. Then, between 1963 and 1975, the Hoetrip Dike was constructed across the water from Enkhuizen to Lelystad, a total distance of 30 kilometres, creating the Markermeer Lake in the south. Water has to periodically be discharged from the lakes to stop an overflow, as many rivers and streams merge into it. But rising sea levels due to climate change could severely put this system to the test in the future. The other reason for the dikes was to reclaim low-lying areas from the water, and this has seen the land area of the Netherlands increase by 626 square miles since the original construction. You can cycle across both of these dikes to explore the provinces of Friesland and Flevoland, but we'd only touched the surface of what North Holland had to offer, and so continued on our journey. The Netherlands is approximately 300 kilometres long and 250 kilometres wide, so it's not inconceivable that on a 2-week holiday you could explore most of the country by bike. One of the most picturesque cycling routes takes you on a loop from the small town of Bergen, through the sand dunes of the west coast and into the pleasant town of Alkmaar. Alkmaar's biggest tourist attraction essentially isn't real. Between April and September, every Friday morning in front of the Way House, the cheese market entertains bustling onlookers with its ceremonial purchasing of the many wheels of cheese on display. It's not a real market and hasn't been since cheese manufacturing went industrial in the 1960s, but the city's legacy for cheese, which stretches back to the 14th century, has seen the tradition upheld. In the good old days before supermarkets, 300 tons of cheese would be sold here every day, with bartering going on late into the night. opening of the market is signified by the ringing of a bell at 10 a.m, after which anywhere between 700 to 1,000 cheeses are inspected by samplers and traders, who test the taste of the interior as well as the look of the exterior. Once the bargaining of the price of the cheese is complete, it's carried to the Waag, where it's weighed to ensure the correct amount is going to the buyer. Finally, the cheese is carried across the square, where it's loaded onto carts that transport it to the buyer's lorries. The job of cheese carrier is a voluntary one, but you need to be fit, as the heavy lifting normally involves 8 wheels of cheese at a time. A single wheel weighs about 13.5 kilograms, with the total used in the market around 30,000 kilograms. You'd certainly need a lot of biscuits to go with all of that. The whole thing is overseen by the cheese father, made visible by his orange hat. Cheese today is bought and sold on the stock exchange, so there's a lot of cheese to produce and plenty of hard work involved just to entertain the crowds. But those who are a part of the Cheese Guild go about their task with dedicated enthusiasm, while getting the crowd involved as much as possible for some free labour. On exploring the rest of the city, you can see why the powers that be have maintained the theatricality of the cheese market in order to bring visitors here. Alkmaar, outside of this weekly event and a decent football team, doesn't have much else in its touristic armoury. Somehow, though, it endears itself, mainly through its charm. The city streets are still laid out as they were in the 17th century, and strolling them, alongside canals and uncluttered coffee shops, is like a purer version of the country's capital. Cleaner, quieter, and quintessentially Dutch. You may only stay for a day, but Alkmaar will win you over regardless.
There's an old saying that God created the earth, but the Dutch created the Netherlands, given the amount of land they've claimed back from the sea to expand their borders. But without windmills, the whole country could be under 2 feet of water. Around here there are low-lying areas which are known as polders, which contain pools of water created from ground pressure, but which have no connection to rivers, seas or lakes. Now when it rains, there's a risk these polders will overflow and flood the surrounding areas, and that's where the windmills come in. They're used to drain the polders and to keep the surrounding soil dry. Given the openness of the landscape to the wind, these windmills were rarely out of use.
150 years ago, there were as many as 10,000 windmills in the Netherlands, whittled down today to a total of just under 1,000, the majority replaced by more powerful drainage systems. Those that remain stand out on the horizon of a flat landscape, luring artists and photographers, but they are also there for historical as well as aesthetic purposes. Windmills are intrinsically linked with the creation of almost 3,000 polders, and the Dutch aren't ready to forget the part they played in reclaiming the country from the water. You'll see plenty travelling around North Holland, but the group nestled around the water at Zaanschans are the most popular. While the east coast has its picturesque fishing villages, The west coast is made up mainly of sand dunes, protecting the immediate interior from the harsh North Sea winds. You don't really meet any towns until you hit Bloemendaal aan Zee in the south of the region, spoken of as the Dutch Ibiza, and the town is the wealthiest in the Netherlands. It's also a stone's throw from the province's quaint second city. Although Amsterdam is the nation's capital, Haarlem is the province's capital, while still only the 11th most populous city in the country. Thus it maintains a more peaceful, subdued atmosphere compared to its rowdy neighbour 30 minutes up the road. It may be modest by nature, but the city seems to stand by the local heroes that made it what it is today. Typifying this is the statue of Lawrence Koster that stands in the main square, a man who, according to Haarlemers, invented modern printing as we know it. The fact that the rest of the world believes it was invented in Germany by Johann Gutenberg a decade later is neither here nor there. The legend goes that Koster was carving the letter A out of a tree when it fell into the sand, and before he could cry Eureka, he realised he'd invented a new vocation. What a tree was doing in the sand is anyone's guess. Not that we don't believe him. It's very difficult to dislike Haarlem, undeservedly neglected as it is, with a centre that's frozen in time like cities such as Bruges and Siena, only without the overwhelming popularity. The city has several noteworthy churches, but it's the Hofjes that are the most famous landmarks off the streets of Haarlem.
Hofjes have been around since the Middle Ages and were originally miniature communities for women centred around a courtyard like this. By the early 18th century, when they were at their most popular, they became a precursor for social housing. The criteria to live in one changed. Not only did you have to be female, but you also had to be over 50, and most of the time the residents were poor and of the same religious persuasion as those who funded the almshouses they resided in.
The buildings hidden away here are still inhabited today, most privately owned, but you can still wander the secluded gardens as a way of finding total solitude in this already calming city. One of the country's best art museums is set around a former Hofje and celebrates one of the Dutch Golden Age's greatest painters. Many artists made Haarlem their home during this period, but none stayed for quite so long as Frans Hals.
Hal's biggest achievement was bringing a sense of realism to his portraits, preferring a semblance of emotion in an expression instead of the traditional blank gaze. Like most renowned artists, he died in poverty, but his reputation lived on when his image was used on the back of Dutch banknotes.
Today, the museum in his name includes more than a dozen of his works, as well as other Dutch painters such as Jan Steen and Johan Verspronck. In the early 17th century, Haarlem prospered before Amsterdam was even a twinkle in the eye. The reason was the explosion of the tulip industry. Today, Haarlem is the centre of the bulb-growing industry once more, and is nicknamed Bloemenstad, meaning flower city. But for now, it was time to make the short trip to Europe's version of Sin City. Amsterdam is a somehow synchronised mixture of both highbrow and lowbrow, although it's the capital's lenience towards certain pastimes that's more renowned than the art scene, quirky shops or waterside architecture. It's not the kind of place for a regimented sightseeing agenda. Instead, the best way to soak up its charming atmosphere is to hang loose and go with the flow, ambling through its distinctive neighbourhoods, crisscrossing canals and meeting its multilingual residents. Obtaining an iAmsterdam card, which gives you discounts as well as transport and museum access, will benefit your visit more than any map.
What you can get out of it will probably depend on how old you are. Students, for example, will probably head straight from the airport to the nearest coffee house, where they can gleefully indulge in the delights of cannabis or marijuana, safe in the knowledge that their parents or the police aren't going to come barging through the door. Travellers who've seen a bit more of the world, though, will know that the city holds attractions of more substantial appeal.
The city began where the Amstel River hit the dam of a sleepy fishing village, hence the name. In medieval times, this was surrounded by a moat. As the city thrived, though, it expanded through the continuing creation of man-made canals that spiralled out from its centre, like ripples from a stone in the water, leaving the web of canals encircling its centre. Today, this quintet is known as the Grachtengordel, or the Five Canals, and is what has determined the natural layout of the city over the centuries. Strolling this neighbourhood over miniature bridges is the classic Amsterdam experience, enhanced by the 17th century mansions that line streets that have hardly seen any means of expansion due to the limited space between canals. You wouldn't believe it when you look at the rusty bicycles nestling on the bottom of some, but the canals are cleaned every night, with the water completely replaced every 3 days. There's also the option to make your base on the water by staying in one of the many houseboats available for rent here. The city has recently started connecting these boats to Amsterdam's sewer system, as previously waste went straight into the canal. I guess that's why there's never any swimmers around. Finding accommodation in the city can be a tricky prospect, not least because Amsterdam is filled with visitors all year round. There are plenty of hostels to choose from if you're looking for the most basic of amenities, but these are constantly in demand. Decent hotels are not quite so plentiful, but the one thing you won't have to worry about too much is location, as the compactness of the city allows you to stay pretty much anywhere and still be within walking distance of all the major sites. Quirkiness is certainly part of Amsterdam's appeal, and the Hotel de Philosophe offers a stay that mixes bordello-style interiors with an intellectual ideology. Epitomising the entanglement of both ends of the cultural spectrum that defines the city, its philosophy is, well, just that, philosophy. Each of the 38 rooms being individually decorated to a different philosophical or cultural principle. Thus, you could be staying under the watchful eye of Confucius or sleeping with Sartre, and your bedside reading may well give you food for thought, as well as there being famous thoughts every morning with your food. The Lloyd Hotel, situated on the East Docklands, opened in 2004 and is one of many new boutique hotels that have sprung up recently in the city, although the building itself dates back to 1921. Where the hotel differs from almost anywhere else is the breadth of quality accommodation offered here. The 117 rooms range from basic one-star bedrooms with a shared bathroom all the way up to 5-star luxury with a grand piano and a bed that sleeps 8. Obviously, the price range varies accordingly, but the service doesn't, and it's easy to see that the same care and consideration in design has gone into all the rooms. It's a unique idea that you'd think would be more popular, as guests return to the hotel for a different experience each time.
Ask yourself this: when was the last time you stayed in a hotel room with a swing?
Amsterdam's most visited sites include some of the best art museums in Europe. The Rijksmuseum houses around 200 masterpieces, including classics from the Dutch Golden Age by artists such as Jan Vermeer, Jan Steen, and our old friend Frans Hals. There's also a host of classics from another Dutch master, Rembrandt, including his most famous work, The Night Watch. Those with a keener interest can also visit Rembrandt House. Then there's probably the most famous Dutch painter of them all, Vincent van Gogh, who, although he created his most famous works in France, has his own museum here. As well as a selection of his most famous works and sketches, the museum has also poured through the back catalogue of his letters in order to publish them for the first time, helping to give an insight into what proved to be a troubled mind. The tales of Van Gogh's mental illness that led to him cutting off part of his ear and eventually shooting himself in the chest have become as famous as his paintings.
One of the places likely to resonate with you most during a trip here is Anne Frank's house. Her story, told in her own words, has been read the world over. When the Nazis began persecuting Jews in the Netherlands, the Frank family were forced into hiding. They chose a secret room in this building here, which was her father's office. They stayed there for 2 years until an informant betrayed them. They were immediately arrested and sent to a concentration camp, where Anne died after just 6 months.
Her diary lived on and was published after the war, symbolising the fight against racism and oppression. The museum opened in 1960, and visitors today can experience the claustrophobia of the actual location where one of literature's greatest works was created out of the worst of times. Amsterdam is full of landmarks and monuments to people who have crusaded for both freedom and liberty, and perhaps that explains the city's most notorious area.
The red light district used to be one of the most affluent areas of the city, lavishly nicknamed the Velvet Canals. Today, though, not too many people come here to admire the architectural heritage of the buildings. Nowadays, visitors are a mixture of students who come to pop their cherries, general curiosity seekers, and the occasional creepy-looking character.
It appears that even Amsterdam is growing tired of the negative side to essentially turning the other cheek. In 2007, a third of all brothels here were closed, and criminal activity linked to the area has increased, amplified by the influx of foreigners both running and involved in the sex trade. Part of this backlash stems from the realisation that the idea of the district is quintessentially Dutch, but that it's no longer the Dutch that have anything to do with it.
You're not allowed to take pictures in the red light district, and so obviously we can't film the ladies hawking their wares either. And to be honest, I'm pretty sure we couldn't get away with filming what's here anyway.
The powers that be now have the dilemma of having to crack down on illegal activities in the neighbourhood, while also somehow maintaining Amsterdam's image of tolerance. The coffee shops too have felt the force of a new wave of rules on the back of the ban on smoking in public. The imposed closing of all coffee shops near schools and a complete ban on magic mushrooms means that perhaps the times they are a-changing for Amsterdammers. But could the city maintain its popularity with the banishment of these vices after decades of building a reputation for turning a blind eye? If you're travelling with someone who's easily shocked though, or more pertinently children, be warned. It's quite easy to stumble into the red light district without realising, especially during the day when the lights are out. It's only when you come face to face with some voluptuous young Dutch girl wearing nothing but goosebumps that you realise your location. In a bizarre coincidence, the coat of arms of North Holland incorporated a triple X 500 years before the letters took on a different connotation. One legacy that isn't distinctive to Amsterdam is Queen's Day. Every year on the 30th of April, the Dutch celebrate the national holiday marking the birthday of the Queen of the Netherlands, a Mardi Gras where the population dresses in orange and sets up stalls to sell their unwanted items. With a little bit of seasonal common sense, the current Queen decided to keep her predecessor's birthday for the celebrations, seeing as hers falls in chilly January. Hardly the time for a street party. Amsterdam sees an estimated 1 million visitors arrive for Queen's Day, and there's no better place to be to experience the biggest celebration in the country.
So why the predilection with the colour orange? Well, it's the colour of the Dutch royal family and represents the Dutch lineage dating all the way back to William of Orange. In recent times, it's come to represent patriotism and invokes a certain pride in being Dutch. The round trip from Amsterdam, encircling Hoorn, Alkmaar and Haarlem, is just over 120 kilometres. So anybody with a reasonable amount of fitness, travelling at an average pace, should be able to circle the province in just a day. There's clearly so much more to the region than just Amsterdam, and if the city continues to slowly eradicate its shady pastimes, then surely it won't be long until visitors realise that there's much more to the capital than just weed and women of the night.
Enjoying the sights from a seat of a bicycle is also a great way to see all the smaller places in between, to keep yourself in shape and do your bit for the environment. Where you stop and for how long is in your own hands, although visiting at the time when spring is coming into bloom would be a recommendation hard to ignore. The people you'll meet here, travelling the compact flats of the lowlands, will welcome you and immediately put you at ease. The expression, so laid back it's horizontal, has never been more apt. The Netherlands has a reputation for overachieving, and you'll find a week in North Holland will similarly exceed all your expectations.